welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, where we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is your host, Julia, and I am so excited to introduce you to Rebekah Diamond, who's the author of the book, Parent Like a Pediatrician. Rebekah and I talk in this episode about how social media and a world in which everyone is an expert has broken parenting. Essentially, that there's so much advice, parents just don't know how to make sense of it. And it's really hard to know what's data-backed, what's research-driven, what is true. I mean, truth on the internet these days is so incomprehensible. And then use that data to make choices that are true for you. So lose the voices from all the social media influencers, etc., and really find your own inner voice. This book is so good. I read it cover to cover in a night the second I had it in my hands, and I was just so sad that I didn't have it in my first year of being a parent. I really love this conversation with Rebekah. In addition to talking about how to think about parenting and some of the guidelines and parameters that can be true for you, we also talk about postpartum anxiety and depression and Rebekah's battle with her own mental health after having her baby. It's a great episode. If you love it as much as I do and you enjoy Stork'd episodes generally, do a couple things. One, please forward it to a friend, particularly somebody in their first year of parenting. Hopefully it gives them some guidance and some support. Two, please give a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And three, sign up for the newsletter. We've got really great content. Thank you. And here is Rebekah.
Rebekah, thank you so much for joining Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define your family lives. One of the things that's so interesting is that we think sometimes that when you build your family life, it's over once you get to baby, right? Like you've got the pot of gold. Some of us, it takes a long time and a lot of hard work to get there. And we don't always think about the transition of our self-identity and our life experiences into parenting. And you have written a book all about that. So I'd love to learn more about the book and learn a little bit more about yourself. Can you tell our audience who you are?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I love everything you do. And I love talking about exactly what you said, that transition through the many stages of parenting and how to focus on your identity, honestly, and how much that helps your kids. So I'm Rebekah Diamond. I'm a hospital pediatrician working in New York City. I'm a mom and I wrote a book, exactly like you said. And, there's a long story and a shorter story. I'm not good at very short stories. I don't really have those, but the shorter, don't really know how. But the shorter story is that this is the book I wish I had as a new parent. And it really is that simple to me. I felt like there was so much information and not enough information at the same time. I was a pediatrician in training when I was pregnant and then when I had my daughter, and it was like kind of amazing to me how unconfident I felt as a new parent and how confused and overwhelmed I felt. And in retrospect, of course, that makes sense. But, I just assumed, I didn't assume it would be easy, but I assumed it would be a lot simpler than it was and that it would feel more empowering than it was. And I do feel like I've come to a great place. It's, of course, a journey, but it took a lot of work to get to the point where information wasn't stressful, where I felt like there was reliable information, where I felt like I even knew how to make choices, which I always say the biggest irony is I was, if anything, told I was overconfident before I had my daughter, in my residency rotations. Again, as a very outspoken young woman, I got plenty of too confident comments. And then when my daughter was born, it was like, oh my God, what do I feed her? How often? What do I do? Is she going to die if I fall asleep holding her? And how do I do this? And do I have to go to the hospital? And it's just like, I was like, wow, if I'm struggling with my tremendous privilege that I had, even in my, I had challenges, but it wasn't like so many people have. And with my knowledge and my background, and I love kids and I've always been around kids and I have all these family members and resources. And I was like, well, if I feel like I can't do it, who does? Who feels like they can do it? And what role do I have as a pediatrician in this world, like sort of helping parents sort through this world that has become so needlessly overcomplicated for parenting?
Yeah. You're echoing two things that were really true for me. One was all the stuff that you've been building for your whole life to become an expert in your chosen field, if you're choosing to work, or even your self-awareness and your sense of self-identity. Like my self-knowledge when I had my kid at 39 was really high. I thought I really got who I was. Like, I know myself. And yet parenting really shakes all that up. All of your sense of I'm smart, I know what I'm doing, I am talented in these areas, I know who I am, all thrown out the window in so many ways.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there's so many things that contribute to that sense of feeling really lost and disempowered, or unempowered. But the thing that I see is that there's more and more recommendations, information, sort of prescriptions than ever, and there's fewer resources. So you have this weird parallel between being told all these things that you have to do somehow and being convinced because you're stressed, overwhelmed, undersupported, susceptible as a new parent, being convinced that you have to do these specific things. But then also being given very few of the tools that you would need if those are even the things you want to do, those specific practices. You can't, I would say 99% of people couldn't do them all, even if they wanted to, even if they were right. You can't exclusively breastfeed and do perfect safe sleep. I mean, that's a 1 in a million scenario to be able to have both of those things line up. You can't be in a world that doesn't have adequate postpartum resources and medical leaves and lactation appointments and parental leave if you're working. You can't do that and then also do all these kind of attachment style things. It just doesn't happen. And so part of the book that my book research and what really helped me reframe things was shifting from this like personal failing, which I don't think you need to even take on to begin with, but I know a lot of parents do when you can't meet certain goals, or if they are what you want to do, these external goals, and shifting it towards the societal level and realizing that everyone kind of does have an agenda. If someone is promoting very strict, any philosophy, attachment parenting is one I talk about a lot. People don't realize that might have roots in certain political agendas that aren't theirs. So digging a little bit into the why and the what works for you in your specific situation was really important for me. But I didn't want to just wing it. I wanted some resource, not someone who would just say, it's fine. Because I did need that. I needed someone to say it was fine, it would be okay. But I was looking for, but what's a range of things that might work for me that are backed by science and experience? And I just couldn't find that anywhere.
I have a couple comments on this, but one is I was talking to somebody who was in the military recently. I've never been in the military, so some of the concepts that come out of that are new for me. And he was saying that you're given these, he calls them left and right limits, which is you can go as far as this on the left side and you can go as far as that on the right side, and they're conceptual limits. And anything within that is your purview to make the right choice under the circumstances with the tools you have to your ability. And it wouldn't be nice if we as parents could understand the left and right limits. On one hand, you want to do everything up to this point for safe sleep. On the other hand, you might have to make a trade-off for sleep with breastfeeding. And if you could understand how those things are relationship to each other and be given permission to make your decisions within that context, that's so much more helpful than do this, do that,
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, the whole idea of a safe range of options is something we use in medicine. I use it with my residents. I use it with the students. It's hard. It's hard to learn that. I understand how hard a concept it is because I teach it. I had to learn it, and now I teach it to medical learners. And there's often okay, Dr. Diamond, what should we do? And I always do the Socratic, what do you want to do? And I remind them, it's not that I don't have an opinion. It's not that I don't think that I could make this medical decision. I feel very confident that I could care for this patient and make those decisions. That being said, it's more important that you know what the safe range of options are and you have a reason for choosing yours. Hopefully, it must be, in my practice, in conjunction with the parents, and with the patient and all of those things. But it's a harder gray zone to live in when we don't have imperatives. And so I think that was a big mental shift for me personally, to go from prescription to possibility.
Let me give you a personal example and bring it into something very little. I'm going to try to find one that's non-controversial. And that is Instagram and all the other moms were teaching me to use wake windows and to use this concept of eat, play, sleep. And that is that you feed the baby, then they play for a little period of time, and then they go to bed. And my kid is not a sleeper. He had the hardest time napping. He would throw these temper tantrums. And my mom kept saying, "You're putting him to bed hungry." And I'd say, no, 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 this is what I'm taught to do. Eat, play, sleep, eat, play, sleep. And I didn't think I was allowed to deviate from that because I had to follow the wake windows. And I was calculating exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes, depending on how old he was. And it wasn't until I let go of that and said, maybe I just feed him before he goes to bed.
Maybe I just feed him when he's hungry.
And it was so embarrassing that it took my mom to say, I think you're starving him a little bit by mistake, My
mom did the same thing for some things. My mom, I am one of 4 and my mom had, and has had lots of experience. And back in the, the good or bad old days when it was like, sometimes I tell her and my dad and all other people in other generations, the things that are happening here and some of the parenting scripts and philosophies and things parents are feeling bad about. And they look at me like I have a hole in my head. They're like, who has time to make up that worry? Like, ain't nobody got time for that kind of thing. And so I've struggled a lot with breastfeeding, and I share a lot online in the book about my breastfeeding struggles and my journey. And that is a great example where, in retrospect, I didn't realize this, but the choices I were making were not the best. They were based on what I thought was my goal, but wasn't really my goal, because I thought my goal was maximal amount of breast milk at all costs, but that really was not what it was in my heart of hearts. That was an anxiety thing and not really understanding all the trade-offs and the mechanics of it. But, when my milk came in, my mom was there with me and I ran and I pumped. I remember it so vividly because I had this feeling of like, if I don't reinforce my milk, she'll be mad and won't come back. Like there was this gotta get it out, gotta save every drop of liquid gold. And I remember my mom, who so sweet, looked at me and was just like, do you think you want to just put her on your breast? Like, I know you want to breastfeed. And I was like, I will. In a minute, I gotta, good to the last drop, gotta get it. It was based on kind of nothing other than some bad advice and misconceptions I had. But it took this level of simplification of like, if you want to breastfeed, you can just breastfeed. And it takes a lot of support. I'm not minimizing that. If you want to feed your baby when they're hungry, you could just do that. If you want to make a schedule that actually works for your life and not an influencer's life, why don't you just do that? But it's like we're in our heads so much about it. And it's been really liberating. It doesn't no, I don't care. If advice should be helpful. This is my newest mantra. If the advice isn't helpful, it's not for you.
I'm struggling to put into words, and I've been struggling with this for a while. And maybe it fits into this left and right limits concept. But on one hand, we live in a world now where we kind of are trained, don't give unsolicited advice. If you've got a new parent, don't jump in and say, oh, you should do this. And I think that's really important because we don't want to force our opinions on others. But as a result, new parents are often left without support. Going, what the hell am I supposed to do? Because everyone's afraid to say, oh, by the way, I had a really hard time breastfeeding. And if you're having a hard time, that's okay. And I'm happy to talk to you about it. Or, you can choose to follow the wake windows or you don't have to. I didn't, I think there's this, we're so afraid to give advice these days that there's no insights from parents who have done it before, who are experienced, who know what they're doing to some extent. My friends who have done it, who had babies before I did, or my mom, they taught me a lot, but they had to cross the boundary of don't give advice in order to teach me something.
Right.
And I don't know whether I prefer a lot of their advice. I hate it. So, I don't know where to say I fit in this,
It's so true. It's funny. My daughter's 5 now, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm really into language and words. And she's been coming home saying, I don't care is a bad word. I've been sort of being a little pedantic and silly with her and saying well, there's no such thing as a bad word. There's just context and tone. And she's 5. I'm like, what are you talking about, Mom? But she's sort of starting to get it. And I think that is true here, that advice is only advice if it's given in the right context and the delivery is appropriate. And there's an understanding also of the context that it comes from. This is someone's personal experience. You should do wake windows because it worked for me, not because it's a biological imperative. It can't just be this surface level, the nosy neighbor stereotype who's like, are you breastfeeding? Do you need the breast pump? How about this? You should really be doing that. That's not advice. that's someone sort of intruding in an unsolicited way. But getting back to the point where we can share experiences and we can share true advice with the context of, this is my professional opinion with this background based on this reasoning. This is my personal opinion based on what happened with my daughter for this reasoning. I understand your situation is different. I mean, that's much more complicated. The internet doesn't reward that. It doesn't give clicks to nuance or, anything other than someone saying, do this, not that, those things.
Yeah. And the problem with the internet is this feedback loop, because if you click on one thing that says that you should sleep train, and I'm going to use sleep training for a very pointed example, one, because you talk about it a lot in the book, and the other is because it was one of those areas where I got a lot of unsolicited advice. I chose not to sleep train. And the trade-off I made, and I made it knowingly, was that I did not sleep for over a year because my kid got up 3 times a night. And I was like, I'm okay with this. I'm going to breastfeed him when he gets up, and that's fine. But everyone, my mom, my friends, et cetera, were like, not only should you sleep train, but I'm going to come to your house and do it for you. And I appreciated the insight that if I had wanted to get more sleep or was struggling and needed to, I could have sleep trained. I knew that was an option. I chose to ignore it. But it was one of those things where I noticed that when I clicked on one video that said I didn't have to sleep train, all of a sudden my entire news feed was about alternative methods of parenting that fit into the paradigm of you don't sleep train. And if I clicked on something that said sleep train, all of a sudden the whole Instagram feed changes based on what you click. And so it gives you more reinforcement around what you may be exploring.
And it becomes more extreme. I think there are smart people who have done studies on this, but it intensifies. It becomes even more rigid, narrow, and intense. And just like all YouTube videos end with for my daughter, end with garbage of kids opening toys and playing with presents and stuff. Like, all Instagram videos end with the most extreme version of the thing you went for that fits that initial click. So you may have started with, okay, here's a very reasonable, balanced set of risks and benefits of sleep training. Find what's right for you. And eventually it ends with, sleep training is child abuse. Your crib is a jail. And those videos very much exist. And who is that helping? I don't know who that helps, but it ends up with a million clicks and the article about the viral video and the TikTok and the this. And it feels somehow correct because it's so pervasive.
I agree.
Even if it's not.
Yeah. And if you're having lots of hormones or lots of big feelings, or you're up late night because your baby's keeping you up and you're doom scrolling Instagram or others, it's a really vulnerable place to be to get information. And so one of the things I love about your book is you give the both ands. You say, here's the data, here's the research. And I felt like when I was reading it as a parent, and by the way, I said this, but I missed reading it when I was a parent in that first year. I really wish I had that. But so if you're a parent in your first year, definitely get this book. But I like that you sort of take away all the clickbait. And it's, here's the data, here's where it comes from, especially in the case of sleep training. Here's where the attachment parenting comes from. And here's where this one comes from. Here's where ferberizing comes from. And make your own decision. And that's right. That's a nice, helpful tool, I think, for so many parents.
Yeah, it's a lot less sexy though. It's unsexy to not have a hot take about everything. I do have hot takes about a lot of things, but at the end of the day, my values really don't matter. I can give you the science and I can give you some of my personal and professional experience, and I can hopefully distill it for you and filter it in a way that's really helpful. But ultimately, the hard work is yours. And I know that can be both liberating and frustrating at the same time when you are in that overwhelmed state. When I just wanted someone to tell me in my postpartum depressed, anxious space, the recipe to not ruining or killing my child. And it's dark. It's a dark thought, but I really think that's what I was looking for. And I felt like I was getting a series of conflicting mandates and impossible goals to reach. And so it's not surprising that by the first week, from a combination of hormones, of course, and my own mental health background and all of those things, but just from unreachable expectations, that my brain reached the conclusion that there was no way to keep everyone alive and safe. It was just not. I can't blame the internet for everything. I can blame it for a lot of things, but it certainly did not help someone like me and like other anxious moms or really just anyone navigating this new space. It's not helpful to be just given a list of conflicting impairments. So I'm so glad that this book has resonated. It really has been healing for me. I'm very much writing it to me, 6 years ago, just saying all the things I wish that I had been able to sort of find somewhere in some way.
You know what the book reminds me of is The Girlfriend's Guide to Pregnancy. And I loved that book because it demystified pregnancy and it just was like so relatable and it was so like chit-chatting with your bestie. And this book to me had that same tone. It had that like, this is my bestie. If she were a pediatrician, just giving me the scoop. Did you intend for that? Was that sort of your hope?
Yeah, I don't really know how to not be like that. I'm constantly just trying to be fun and funny. I'm glad it succeeds sometimes, but I just want to help. Like, I want to help past me and my own healing journey. And I want to help new parents. And how, to the point of how you deliver information is really important. I'm not giving prescriptions. Even when there is kind of a yes, no answer, I want you to choose that on your own. And I say this a lot as a slight tangent. It's a controversial topic, unfortunately, is the vaccine topic. I used to kind of just live in this rage of why won't parents vaccinate their kids? And it took me becoming a mom on my own and doing more research and just becoming a little more mature to realize that's not the problem. It's how are parents being put in this situation where they're getting such bad information or they're being so manipulated that they're making this choice that is incongruent with their goals of keeping their kid healthy. That's enraging to me at a different level. And so even with the topic that if you ask me, should I give my kid this vaccine? And I would say, do you want a yes, no answer? And you say yes. I would say yes. And then that would be it. And that could be the whole conversation if that's what you wanted. But I want you to feel good about that choice. I want you to have the right information to make that choice, the ability to feel supported as you engage in critical thinking, as you teach that skill to your child, which is so important in this misinformation age. I don't want to say you have to vaccinate your kid. Of course, I want your kid to be vaccinated, but I want to get you to the point where you understand why I want that and feel good about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And a lot of the conversations I have around infertility or creating families when there's some barrier, whether it's a fertility diagnosis, whether it's like me not having a partner or something else, is that sometimes you feel like the choice has been taken away from you in your life, right? Mm-hmm. Like you feel so helpless and so powerless. And I think sometimes when you're dealing with medical professionals, you can feel the same way, particularly in the way that most medical professionals were male until recently, and they prescribed information without necessarily giving you their thinking or their background. And you didn't necessarily have the option to say no, ask questions, push back, or even seek different advice. So I really do think it's healthy for us all to push back on medical professionals like you.
Please.
And I also think it's healthy to feel like you have some agency when you're talking to parents who want to have that choice and may be leaning towards a choice you don't necessarily recommend. How do you take into account the history of the medical professions, your goals to help me empower me as a parent? It feels like there's a lot of extra work to go through.
It's so much work. And the reality is, even the doctors who want to do it don't necessarily have the time or have the training. And it's, I am not here to say like, yay, medical profession, it's so great. It's ironic to me when people are sort of like, oh, you're for big pharma, you're for big medicine. Cause I'm like, oh, you should talk to my residents. They do not think I like this system very much, because I don't, for all those reasons you're saying. I mean, it's so complicated. The history of it isn't just, it's much darker than not listening. It's true lack of autonomy. It is horrible, horrible injustices that have been done and continue to be done against differentially, non-white groups, especially non-male groups. It's really, really dark stuff. And we do have to be very, very careful of not just how we're presenting the information, but that, in the context that patients are giving us. So to answer your question, it's really tricky. I'm really fortunate in my practice to have a lot more time because I'm in an academic inpatient practice. I understand that it's like a drop in the pond often when I am able to spend this time and chip away. And that at the bigger level, there is how we fight misinformation online, how we empower, how we make real reform in the medical establishment to earn people's trust. I think that's really important. But on my level, I just try to say, just to remind myself, I'm not here to convince anyone to do anything. Ultimately, the decisions for the most part are going to be left to the parent, and especially in these somewhat gray areas. All I can do is hear where they're coming from and give them information that, they're ready to receive.
I think that's interesting. Well, let's talk about it in the context of mental health, because you have mentioned your own postpartum anxiety. It can be especially hard, whether you're the friend of somebody or it's your daughter or your partner, if they're going through something such as postpartum anxiety, postpartum depression. How do you, identify that either for yourself or for somebody that you know and love? And how do you have those conversations?
Yeah. I'm an outlier in the sense that I've always had issues with anxiety and occasionally depression. And so I went into this pregnancy extremely like, oh, we're going to be proactive. We're going to have the psychiatrist on speed dial and the therapist is going to meet maybe a little extra. I was like, it was like going on dates, trying to find the OB that was going to like be my point person. And she was, I had the most incredible OB in the world. So my team was like there. My whole, I'm very outspoken. I also knew what the clinics had around me. I was in residency there. So when the depression and anxiety hit, I was fortunate to be able to say, I think it was day 7 when my daughter, after she was born, I just couldn't stop crying. I cried basically the whole day. And my husband asked, what should we do? And I said, call this friend. And he had her number. And then same day I had an appointment. It was that kind of thing. But it's not always that clear in terms of what's going on. And then of course the connection to resources is not always
totally
that. So, they have all the signs of depression, anxiety that you'll read about and learn about. And I think that awareness is really important. I would like to, I guess my biggest PSA would be I know it's hard to get help for yourself and either you don't recognize it or you don't feel like you need it. But, it's not always this thing, but I would say if it helps you to think that this is for your child, I think you should just remember that taking care of yourself isn't in spite of your kid. You're not weak for getting help. You're not, there's nothing intrinsically good about suffering. We have this weird misconception that women should like suffer. I think I had a great psychiatrist who once said that to me. She was like, why do you think that you deserve to suffer in pregnancy? And I was like, I never thought about it like that. But I guess, and there's difference between having challenges and being upset and dealing with the negative, but that suffering component, if you're suffering, I think you can just try to go off that spidey sense. If you're suffering, a loved one is suffering. It's not just this or that, or you're just not sure if there's something deeper going on. I would say make that appointment, give it, push yourself, push that person, do the thing that makes it happen. So sometimes we give recommendations, but not resources. Say, I'm up all night with the baby tonight. You're going to get a good night's sleep. My mom's going to come over, a friend's going to come over. We're going to drive you to this thing. If you hate it, you never have to go again. I just want to see how it goes. Could you please do that? But not just saying you need to go get help. I mean, that helps no one. But I think really showing up for yourself and for other people, if you don't know, just look for some sort of help. And there are increasing resources out there.
It's so important. And it's so important too that we're having conversations like this. And I'm grateful for you to be open and honest about it. It wasn't frankly until like 9 months into having a kid that I even knew that postpartum anxiety existed. We talk so much about postpartum depression. And I saw those little letters somewhere, PPA, and I was like, what is this?
I know.
Yeah.
My own psychiatrist was like, did you know postpartum anxiety existed? I was like, yes, but like, I'm not your...
Yeah.
She's like, most people don't. I'm like, well, like, I'm a pediatric resident.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Hopefully I have some, but not all pediatric residents do.
Yeah. And it's important for us all to know and pay attention to and pay attention to what the signs are, easily Googleable if you need to find them. So we're talking at multiple levels. We're talking at the micro level. How do you make little day-to-day decisions that are important for your experience as a parent and for your kid's first year? how long to breastfeed, whether to breastfeed, what kind of formula. These are the tiny little decisions. What is baby-led weaning, or what is feeding babies all about? And what's the first foods that you should consider? Like little things like that are actually the very, very, very big things of parenting in the first year. We're talking about that. And then we're also talking about this macro level. What is the medical institution? How do we get information as a society? What's broken with our world right now? That's a lot to hold, and it's a lot for you.
Yeah.
If you could change like one or two things about the parenting experience, if you could just like be like, this is my soapbox, I'm going to make sure these changes happen for all of us as parents. What might those be?
Man, I've actually never been asked that. I've been asked a lot of different things. So it's a great question. What would I change besides, a glib like, oh my God, so many things, how to use and choose? I mean, depending on how broad you want to go, at least in the United States, I would change the societal support. I think that's probably the number one. It's not maybe the cause of all the parenting, lack of confidence and stress, but it certainly is the reason it thrives. Because if you really felt, supported and have the resources you need, it would be harder to turn that exhaustion and anxiety into kind of selling whatever brand of thing or whatever claim, whatever product is being sold to you. So it kind of the industry, the parenting industry, which I'm, a reluctant part of, but the downside or the bad side in my mind of the parenting industry relies on you to be so exhausted and unsupported. Because otherwise, what's it going to capitalize on? Otherwise, you might just be busy figuring it out and getting advice from your village and so on. So we need like basic things. It's crazy we don't have parental leave.
Great. Crazy.
It's crazy.
Crazy.
I mean, there's just like, there's just the fact that this is even a conversation of if you need it, if we can afford, like the conversations that you're having about it, you're like, this is the Twilight Zone. That doesn't make any, I have horror stories from my practice. I had a mom who had to go back to work at 4 weeks postpartum because she would lose her health insurance. She needed her health insurance to take care of her chronically ill older child who was in the hospital under my care. So she spent her whole day working, then coming to her, very seriously ill child. She was trying to pump there at that time. Then she would sort of half asleep, go home, be with her newborn, go back to work. Like, in what world is that pro-family, pro-and? It's so nonsensical. She was falling asleep looking at me. It was just I felt like, how can we even claim to be a society of parents if as parents we don't address this at a systemic level?
It's just atrocious.
Yeah. And I mean, things like that happen at all levels. Even my smaller version of it, which I share, my residency program did what they felt they could to support me and what they could to support me postpartum. But it was really only 6 full weeks off, followed by 4 weeks part-time. At 10 weeks, I went fully back to work, or I would have had to finish residency a whole year because I had to take some disability leave for my first trimester. And I was at a premature baby and I was a post C-section. And I was going to the clinic at 6 weeks, sobbing. I remember going to my friend's house because we did a nanny share there. I remember going there and just falling on her couch and just crying and just being like, my body is rejecting this. It's rejecting this whole process.
Yeah. And it's so funny to me because the medical system should know better. It should know how our bodies heal. It should know how our brains heal. It should know what babies need. In fact, we know that. We have the data to prove it. And yet one of the biggest and most offensive professions against women, particularly postpartum women, is the medical profession.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about, the changes we need to make, I mean, we are kind of screaming for it, and the medical system is not changing at a pace that makes any sense. And yet our own institutions are giving this advice that assumes a certain amount of parental leave. So it's this upside down, infuriating, gaslighting situation where I'm like, wait, I'm telling parents to room share, breastfeed, this, that, the other thing, 6 months of this, and you gave me 6 weeks of parental leave. And we're giving other families even less with no home visits, no lactation support. none of the things that they need. And I'm sorry, you want me to give this advice with a straight face? And I did. I gave that advice with a straight face. And then I had a child and I was like, oh, that's monstrous. I'm never going to tell you to do that. I'm never going to tell you to exclusively breastfeed. Like, if that's not your goal and you're back at work and X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It's just so hard. Okay, so changing the way in which we support parents would be a goal. I think that's wonderful. And then, what I read in your book is, on a more personal level, empowering parents to make great decisions that fit their needs and their lifestyle.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, I was looking for empowerment for sure, and I was getting either advice or like things to do or being told it was all okay. Like I was getting reassurance or kind of mandates. Wasn't getting information and empowerment in a real way. And I would like for new parents to have a place, have some sort of framework where they go into this journey and they say, okay, like obviously this is a change. I maybe need to do some sort of research. I didn't grow up with a lot of kids, or things have been different since I was a kid. And we don't as society do the thing, like actually have any open outdoor parenting. We still even yell at women for breastfeeding outside. So like, how would you even know? It's okay to want more information, but how do you seek out and find and internalize the information that isn't just there telling you, just overcomplicating things and giving you prescriptions? How do you actually say, that's interesting. Like, here's the big buckets of ways that you can have your infant sleep. I would like to try these three. These three look like they could work for me. And then that's kind of it. And then the feedback comes from yourself and your own family. And it doesn't really matter what, Parenting Pro 2000 says on Instagram.
So would you say, if you were to characterize the concept of parenting like a pediatrician, which is the title of your book, would you say it's being armed with data, but not obsessively diving too far into ridiculous details?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I'm going to use that. Okay. I'm going to use you. You're my new brand manager. No, I mean, it came from this juxtaposition of all the seasoned expert pediatrician moms when when my daughter was born would say things like, yeah, we say this, but here's what I do. And I was like, what? Like, you do that? I'm like, well, yeah, because the data about in room sharing is actually pretty weak when you take this out. So I don't really think it needs to be big on the list. And I was like, well, they didn't teach me that. Like, so I was just telling people to do all these things and I didn't understand. And they're like, well, my goal was this. So I did this and I did that. And I worked with my pediatrician to do this. And it was just this completely different framework, again, for partnership and empowerment that I just was not finding.
I keep hearing you use the word goals. So now I'm starting to reframe my perception of parenting like a pediatrician as sort of knowing the data and making choices that support your goals. How do you set goals? Like, how do you know what your goals should be?
Therapy?
Like, for instance, let's use breastfeeding, for example. At first, my goal was to make it a year if I could. And then I had a hard time around 4 months. And so I was like, okay, maybe I can make it to 6 months. And pushed through that, lots of tears. It was horrible. Once I hit a year, I was like, I could go forever. So like my goals kept shifting and I had no way of knowing what my goal should actually be. I think the goal setting part is really hard.
It is hard because it's kind of like you don't know what you want to do till you do it. You don't know the supports you need till you have them. But I think part of the goal, the issue in why we can't frame goals or have goals is because we're being presented, we don't even understand what the scope of goals could be. So like with breastfeeding, it's very much presented as like, should I try breastfeeding or not? Well, I think that's kind of a very outdated conversation. And when I see parenting books for the nitty gritty of like, here's the data saying that it's fine to do formula, do as much formula as you want. And here's the data saying why breastfeeding is good. It's like, okay, that's important as the first step in your journey. But the question to me, the harder question is not whether you should try to breastfeeding. It's like, how do you know if it's working? How do you weigh the pros and cons of it? How do you get the support? At what point do you decide that it doesn't work for you? And so to me, in the case of what is your goal, I went into breastfeeding with the goal of, I'm a pediatrician. I know what the AAP says. I'm a type A person. My goal is to get every single drop of liquid gold breast milk into my child's mouth till their 12-month birthday. And that was it. That's not really based on anything that makes sense for my situation. And the data behind it is not as binary as that either, because the data really says that breastfeeding is good when you can do it. It's basically, it's good until it's not good. It's good when it's good. So in a society that gives you the maximal supports, when biology cooperates, when your mental health cooperates, if you wanted to you didn't have some sort of aversion to breastfeeding, if you thought this was something, if you could get to the point where you felt this was positive, which most parents do, then it is worth doing and it is worth trying. But the idea that it is somehow this like black or white concrete goal that has some sort of magical value divorced from the reality of it, that's not really based on anything. So if I were to do things again, or if I were to look back on it, it would have been nice to know that my real goal was my child's health and my health. So that was the real goal. Like the real goal was, how do I best support my child's health without not having the expense of my own? Because if my health is bad, her health is going to suffer too, because I'm her primary caretaker. And we just know that from research. If that had been the goal that was front and center, I earlier on might have been more empowered to say, okay, how do I actually like establish breastfeeding? What's the best way to do that in a way that might be more sustainable and pleasant for me, and also better for my daughter? I would have advocated to stay in the hospital longer. I was discharged too early. I would have advocated for my lactation support. I wouldn't have run to a pump right away. I would have done different kind of research, not is breast milk good, yes or no. I would have done a very much more practical research. And then I would have quickly realized that I hated pumping, and I would have stopped it sooner because I really hated it. And it really worsened my anxiety and depression. And I maybe would have had a latch and been able to do that. Or maybe I wouldn't have, and we would have gone to formula and I would have lived my life. So it's just that refocusing on a bigger picture goal and realizing that you just make the decision you can with the situation at the time.
Yeah. I'm hearing that. I'm really hearing the reframing the goal. And that amazingly is like totally just transformed the way I'm thinking about parenting. But I'm also hearing reframing the question. It's not, am I breastfeeding or giving formula? It's not breast is best or formula is also wonderful. It's, you just listed like 20 different questions. It's, am I willing to make a trade-off between my mental and physical health for my baby's health? To what extent? What percentage of the time am I pumping versus breastfeeding? What percentage of the time am I doing formula? It's not either or, formula or breastfeeding. There's a mix. Mm-hmm. So you laid out like 20 different questions that I didn't even know were questions.
I didn't either. And, it's this crazy society we live in where we don't have really nuanced expert breastfeeding medicine trained pediatricians and lactation consultants who come and are readily available. We don't have the leave that would actually support these things. So if you just get to the point where you're like, this is impossible, literally, to make any choice, then you might be right. And honestly, that's not a failure in any way. You have not chosen, you have been born into a circumstance, into a society where this whole, idealistic range of possibilities that we talked about, the left and the right, they actually aren't as wide as they are for other people or as people are painting them out to be. And so for you, if you get to the point where actually breastfeeding is not so bad, or I actually really like it, a lot of people enjoy it. It's weird. It's a crazy thing where, or, I like breastfeeding, but not pumping, or actually pumping is okay. I like it for this reason, or it's great up until 4 months. There's nothing magic about 4 versus 6 months, or actually it's going really great, but I only like to do it twice a day. I only like to do it before naps. I don't like this. And I want to do it for 20 months, but exactly in this way. All those little chemicals that everyone's talking about with the gut and the microbiome, they're in the happy breast milk too. Like they don't have to be in the breast milk that I produce while I'm crying and power pumping on a night shift. Like they're still there. And if your baby gets a drop of it, gets a lot of it, gets none of it,
it's okay.
it's what your baby needs. It's what your baby needs. It's what you need. If you feel good about it, that's what matters.
This is so helpful. See, this is why you got to read the book and get such good advice. Rebekah, 2 questions. One is a question I ask every guest, and you've seen a ton of families through your practice and in your own family life and through writing the book. How would you define family? What does that word mean to you?
These are the hot questions, the hard-hitting questions. I grew up with a very big, intense, interconnected family. To me, it's always been, that circle of brothers, sisters, mothers, cousins. And, for me, that will always be true. That's my circumstance. And I'm very lucky to have that. And then have a few selected friends that are really more like family. And then, of course, have the family I've created with my husband and my daughter. But I think for you, it's your circle. It's your people who, hopefully for the most part, we all have issues with our families.
For sure.
That's not a hot take, but it's the people for whom, they are helping you with that framework of empowerment. They're along for the ride, and it's ideally unconditional. We talk a lot about in parenting, unconditional love and support. And it doesn't mean that you never get angry. It doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes, but just showing up in a physical, emotional, in some sort of way. I feel very lucky that I've always had that. So, yeah, we've had it, it's mostly my biological family, but I have family members who have been adopted. I have obviously multiple in-laws who have married into families. And so the way that you create that family, I love that you talk about the many different ways, the endless possibilities of creating that circle.
Endless possibilities. And not all of them include kids. So not all of them need this book. But if you do have young children in the house and you do want to see the perspective a pediatrician has and the data that is presented from a pediatrician, I really recommend this book, Parent Like a Pediatrician. Where can we find it? Where can we find you? Where can we find all the resources that you offer?
Yeah, come find me. I'm everywhere. I am online a fair amount, although setting boundaries these days, so on a little bit less. But I'm on Instagram at Parent Like a Pediatrician, or my website, parentlikeapediatrician.com. But most of my interactive stuff is on Instagram. Links to my book are on my website or on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, your local bookstore, your library. If finances are an issue, please, there's an ISBN number. You can request it from your library. I would love for you to have this without any sort of, financial barriers.
Awesome. Well, this was so fun. I'm really glad we got to chat.
I loved it. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.